Modern cosmology relies on spatial geometry to define the strict parameters of reality, whether evaluating a classical Newtonian void or the curled-up subatomic topologies of string theory. Science has historically conceptualized parallel universes and alternate realities as discrete spatial coordinates, places separated by physical distance. The temporal frequency model proposes that reality exists as an infinitely dense, singular data stream. This split-screen diagram illustrates the difference. On the left, spatial models pack dimensions inside microscopic spaces. On the right, a waveform passes through a Fourier transform, separating into discrete, overlapping frequency bands. These superimposed dimensions occupy identical space, remaining mutually invisible without harmonic resonance. Theoretical physics utilizes the observer's physical frame of reference and velocity to establish the relativity of space and time. The temporal frequency model applies this exact principle to biology. An organism's perceivable universe is dictated by the processing speed of its biological hardware. Alternate realities occupy our immediate space, rendered invisible by neurological architecture calibrated to filter high-frequency environmental data. According to the principle of biological relativity, temporal rendering and subjective reality are mathematically constrained by an organism's total body mass and metabolic rate. In sensory processing, this temporal resolution is measured by the critical flicker fusion threshold, or CFF. This represents the absolute lowest frequency of a flashing light source at which a biological visual system perceives continuous, uninterrupted illumination. This allometric scaling graph plots total body mass against temporal resolution in Hertz. Notice highly active avian species and small mammals exhibit thresholds approaching 200 Hertz. The human baseline sits lower, at 60 Hertz. Sensory sampling frequency follows this curve strictly. To an organism operating at 200 Hertz, human baseline reality appears as a slow-moving, nearly static environment. Conversely, massive animals with low metabolic rates experience rapid environmental changes as a continuous, imperceptible blur. In signal processing, attempting to capture a continuous signal with a sampling rate that is too slow causes temporal aliasing. The undersampled high-frequency information is distorted or lost from the data stream. This rapid sine wave represents high-frequency data passing through a fixed human 60 Hz frame rate. The output is disjointed. The brain lacks resolution for these spatial state transitions. As data speed increases, the waveform slips between the scanning frames, generating a blank output. Any kinetic entity or waveform operating at a frequency exceeding our biological Nyquist limit literally vanishes into the blind spots between our cognitive frames. Higher dimensional entities occupy these blind spots between the slow, fixed frames of human biological rendering. This inability to perceive high-frequency data is an aggressive, evolutionarily programmed neuroanatomical deletion system. Sensory deletion is governed by a thin, shell-like structure located between the cerebral cortex and the dorsal thalamus, the thalamic reticular nucleus, or TRN. The TRN functions as a gatekeeper. It evaluates incoming synaptic inputs and deletes temporal information that exceeds standard baseline frequencies, preventing it from reaching conscious realization. During periods of rest, neurons in the sensory sectors of the TRN rely on the activity of low-threshold Cav V3.3 calcium channels. The detection of high-frequency kinetics triggers strong repetitive burst discharges of GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This imposes delta-dominated rhythms on the sensory cortex, acting as an off switch that deletes high-frequency stimuli. Genetic mechanisms, specifically the expression of the ERB4 gene, govern the absolute sensitivity and thickness of this sensory firewall. Without this TRN-mediated feedback inhibition, the cerebral cortex would be overwhelmed by cross-stimulus interference from multidimensional spectral data. Human reality is a censored, low-bandwidth hallucination, optimized by biological hardware for surviving physical threats. Explaining multiple dimensions within the same physical space requires a transition to frequency domain mathematics. The continuous time Fourier transform bridges the time domain and frequency domain. Analyzed through this integral, discrete spatial coordinates dissolve into a spectrum of harmonics. Overlapping dimensional realities exist in superposition, just as a spectrum analyzer detects hundreds of overlapping radio waves simultaneously. Instead of asking where an object is located, the frequency domain representation asks how much of each pure frequency is present in the total system. This aligns with the vibrational fabric model, where photons and matter are unique patterns of localized oscillation within a unified, viscoelastic cosmic vacuum lattice. Constructive interference occurs when an observer's internal cognitive processing frequency exactly matches an environmental bandwidth. That match causes the bandwidth to crystallize into a tangible reality. Interdimensional access purely requires adjusting an internal vibrational frequency to achieve harmonic resonance with a target bandwidth. If the brain acts as a frequency filter, we must ask if consciousness is an emergent byproduct of the brain or an independent oscillator temporarily tethered to it. Normal human cognition relies on lower frequency bands, strictly bound by the TRN's firewall, from delta waves in sleep up to beta waves for active problem solving. High-amplitude gamma wave synchronization, operating at 100 Hz or more, globally synchronizes billions of neurons. This hyper-coherent state bypasses the localized modular processing forced by the TRN. Decades of longitudinal data from the Monroe Institute's Discovery Program provide empirical evidence of this bandwidth shifting. Researchers utilized spatial angle modulation audio technologies to entrain subjects beyond baseline processing rates and into extreme gamma ranges. EEG monitoring verified interhemispheric amplitude symmetry and the simultaneous firing of delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma waves into a 100 Hz evolved mind pattern. Under strictly controlled double-blind protocols, these extreme gamma ranges synchronized with verifiable target score 1 hits in remote viewing and phenomenological reports of bilocation. The studies also documented neural resonance. A sender non-locally transmits a coherent 100 Hz frequency, which is then mirrored perfectly in a distant recipient's neural architecture. This documented neural resonance suggests that consciousness operates as an entangled, non-local frequency broadcaster once it overrides the TRN's low-frequency constraints. The ultimate test of the hardware oscillator model lies in terminal biological events. As metabolic systems collapse during physical death, the high-energy GABAergic inhibition of the TRN firewall fails. The oscillator undergoes a signal class transition, represented by this formula, where the core consciousness permanently untethers from temporal aliasing. Freed from the low-pass biological filter, the conscious information assumes an unbound infinite bandwidth state, integrating into the broader resonance field of the universe. Near-death experiences, characterized by the dissolution of linear time, are the first-person phenomenological experience of naturally shifting into a wider bandwidth. This preservation of conscious information is supported by the orchestrated objective reduction model, proposed by Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. This logic also applies to non-human intelligences. To interact with our specific reality tunnel, a high-frequency entity must deliberately downshift its signature to bypass the TRN without being deleted as noise. Conversely, humans achieve real-time perceptual access to these overlapping data streams when high-gamma coherence temporarily untethers consciousness from its biological anchor. Humanity is immersed in an infinitely dense universe, blind to realities occupying the same space because our hardware restricts us to a single narrow channel.